Have you ever walked past an old building and noticed a door that seems completely useless? Maybe it sits 3 stories above the street with no balcony beneath it and no visible staircase leading up. Maybe it opens onto a wall, a narrow ledge, or a space that clearly was not meant to be there anymore. At first, it seems like nothing more than an architectural mistake. Old buildings were renovated, after all. Walls were moved, staircases removed, and rooms were divided into smaller spaces. But sometimes the strange details are not isolated mistakes. They form patterns. Oversized doorways, sealed openings, staircases that suddenly stop, interior balconies, light wells, heavy beams, old utility lines, and rooms whose proportions seem completely wrong for the purpose the building is supposed to have served. When enough of these clues appear together, a much more interesting question emerges. What if we are looking at buildings whose original purpose has been partially forgotten? Not necessarily evidence of a lost civilization, not necessarily proof of a hidden empire, but evidence that the people who built and used these structures may have organized their cities very differently from the way we imagine them today. And if that is true, then one of the strangest clues may be hiding in plain sight: doors that lead nowhere. When we look at an old city photograph, we usually see the street. We see horse carts, storefronts, pedestrians, signs, towers, and enormous facades. The street becomes the story. But a photograph taken from the pavement can only show us one layer of a building. It cannot tell us what was happening behind the windows. It cannot show us the circulation system inside. It cannot reveal what existed above the visible storefront or behind the walls, and it certainly cannot tell us what those spaces were used for decades earlier. The original investigation behind this subject focuses heavily on exactly that problem. Buildings that appear ordinary from the outside can contain internal structures that suggest much more complicated patterns of movement and use. Think about the way we understand a modern shopping center. You enter through one door, but the activity does not stop at the entrance. There may be multiple floors, escalators, elevators, galleries, service corridors, loading areas, storage rooms, restaurants, offices, and hundreds of individual businesses. From the outside, you might only see a facade. Inside, an entire economy is operating vertically. Now imagine an older commercial building designed around a similar principle but using staircases, hoists, galleries, light wells, and mechanical lifts instead of modern escalators and elevators. Suddenly, an upper floor doorway does not look so strange. It may have been part of a circulation system that no longer exists. This is where the idea of the vertical market becomes fascinating. The concept suggests that commerce may not have always been concentrated at street level. Upper floors could have contained shops, workshops, storage areas, galleries, exchanges, or other commercial spaces. The ground floor storefront would then have been only the visible entrance to a much larger internal environment. The original source describes unusual upper floor circulation, oversized lifting systems, reinforced floors, and interior spaces that appear to have supported movement of goods and people. But there is an important distinction to make. Finding an unusual doorway does not prove a hidden market existed. Finding a large staircase does not prove Tartaria existed. Finding a sealed corridor does not automatically mean someone was hiding history. Old buildings change, businesses close, property boundaries move, safety regulations evolve, owners renovate, entire floors can be redesigned. So the real mystery is not whether every strange feature has a secret explanation. The mystery is whether enough of these features survive in enough places to justify looking more closely. And one of the most revealing places to look is the interior light well. Older commercial blocks often needed ways to bring daylight and fresh air into deep buildings. A central open shaft could run upward through several floors, surrounded by balconies and walkways. On paper, that sounds completely ordinary. But what if the openings facing those light wells look more like commercial entrances than simple ventilation openings? What if they contained decorative molding, thresholds, transoms, display-like windows, or other details suggesting that people were expected to approach them? The source material specifically highlights upper-level doorways facing interior light wells and argues that some may have functioned as retail frontage rather than purely service access. Imagine what that would look like. You enter an old building through a modest doorway from the street. Instead of immediately finding a conventional shop, you discover a central open space rising several stories. Around it are galleries. Behind those galleries are additional rooms. Merchants stand behind counters. Goods are carried between levels. Customers walk along balconies overlooking the center. Natural light falls from above. The building is not simply a collection of rooms stacked vertically. It is an interior marketplace. From the street, you might never know it existed. And that could explain why some historical photographs seem to show surprisingly modest storefronts attached to buildings with enormous internal volumes. The visible street-level business may have represented only a fraction of the building's actual activity. The rest could have been hidden above, behind narrow entrances and internal corridors. Then we encounter another clue: the stairs. A staircase is more than a way to move between floors. It records movement. Thousands of footsteps can gradually polish stone and wood. Handrails can show where people repeatedly reached. Corners can become damaged. Treads can wear differently depending on traffic. If a building contains heavily worn internal staircases, while its main street entrance appears comparatively less worn, the pattern becomes worth investigating. The original transcription points to exactly this kind of contrast and suggests that internal circulation may have once been more important than the modern layout indicates. But again, there are multiple possible explanations. Heavy internal wear could indicate employees moving between floors. It could reflect residents. It could indicate warehouse activity. It could simply be the result of a building's particular history. The evidence does not automatically tell us which explanation is correct. That is why the strongest mystery is not a single clue. It is the combination. Imagine finding a heavily worn staircase, a wide upper doorway, an old hoist opening, reinforced floor beams, and multiple utility connections in the same building. Any one of those features could have an ordinary explanation, but together they begin to suggest a building designed for substantial movement and activity. Now look at neighboring buildings. In older districts, openings between properties were sometimes created, modified, and eventually sealed. Today we tend to think of each building as a separate object, but historically, adjacent structures could have been connected through corridors, passages, courtyards, and upper-level walkways. The source describes bricked-up connections and floor-level continuity that raise the possibility that some apparently separate buildings once operated as connected spaces. That changes the scale of the mystery. Maybe the building was never meant to function alone. Maybe the block was the real unit. A merchant could receive goods through one entrance, move them through a service corridor, lift them to another level, display them in an upper gallery, and complete a transaction without returning to the main street. In such a system, the sidewalk would be only one part of the city's economy. The rest would exist inside the buildings, above the street, behind the walls, and sometimes between properties. This is why the phrase vertical market is so compelling. It describes the city not as a flat network of streets, but as a three-dimensional system. The street is one layer. The upper galleries are another. Basements are another. Roof connections could form another. Interior courtyards could function like private streets. The building itself becomes infrastructure. And once you think about cities this way, certain architectural details begin to look different. Take an oversized doorway. Today, we might assume it was designed for a large piece of furniture or a goods lift. That is certainly possible. The source discusses wide openings associated with hoists and lifting systems, some apparently large enough to accommodate substantial loads. But if those openings are repeated across several levels, another possibility emerges. The building may have been designed around regular vertical movement. Goods had to go somewhere. People had to move. Waste had to leave. Air had to circulate. Heat had to spread. Light had to reach interior spaces. A truly active upper-floor economy would require all of those systems. And some old buildings contain surprisingly complex infrastructure. There may be drains running through floors. Ventilation shafts may connect different levels. Old gas lines may appear in unusual patterns. Heating channels may run through walls. Early electrical installations may contain more lighting points than a modern observer would expect for a simple residential floor. The source interprets these features as possible evidence of commercial or densely occupied spaces. But there is another interpretation worth considering. Perhaps these buildings were not mysterious at all. Perhaps they were simply much more heavily occupied than we realize. A large hotel could require extensive lighting and ventilation. A department store could need hundreds of fixtures. A factory could require reinforced floors. A warehouse could require hoists. A public hall could need powerful ventilation. A workshop could produce waste that required drainage. In other words, the architecture may be telling us something real without necessarily supporting the most dramatic theory. It may be telling us that the building had a different function. And that is still fascinating, because the original function is often where the mystery begins. A building can survive for 100 years while its purpose changes 5 or 6 times. A market becomes offices, offices become apartments, apartments become storage, storage becomes a restaurant. Each new owner modifies the interior. Walls are added, doors are blocked, staircases disappear, utilities are replaced. Eventually, someone walks into the building and sees the final version and assumes it has always looked that way. But buildings have memories. They preserve old layers. A painted line beneath modern plaster can reveal a former wall. A filled doorway can reveal an earlier circulation pattern. A strange floor height can indicate that a level was altered. A sealed shaft can reveal the existence of a former mechanical system. Even the position of windows can sometimes reveal where old floors once existed. The source describes this idea in one particularly striking way. Older markings can survive beneath layers of paint and newer partitions, preserving traces of spaces that no longer match the current room layout. That is architectural archaeology, and it does not require a conspiracy. It requires attention. But there is one question that remains difficult to ignore. Why were some of these spaces sealed? If a floor became obsolete, why not simply renovate it? Why close a doorway completely? Why cap a lift shaft? Why cover windows? Why divide large galleries into small rooms? There are ordinary answers: fire safety, new building codes, changes in transportation, changes in property ownership, economic decline, modernization, insurance requirements, reduced demand for upper-floor retail. The original source itself discusses the possibility that urban reform and changing regulations gradually transformed these buildings, making open galleries and flexible commercial spaces less compatible with the standardized modern city. And perhaps that is what happened. Not an enormous secret, just modernization. But modernization can erase more than people realize. When a city becomes standardized, irregular spaces become inconvenient. When businesses want predictable floor plans, old galleries become obstacles. When elevators replace manual hoists, old shafts become useless. When fire regulations change, open circulation systems can become liabilities. When cars change the geography of commerce, upper-floor retail can lose its advantage. The building remains. The system disappears. And eventually, nobody remembers what the system was. This may be why some old structures feel strangely incomplete. They were not designed for the way we use them today. We inherited the shell after the original behavior disappeared. And that creates a fascinating historical illusion. We see a doorway that appears useless and assume the architect made a mistake. But perhaps the mistake is ours. We are judging the building according to a later layout. The doorway may have made perfect sense when another building stood beside it. The staircase may have made sense when the upper gallery was open. The balcony may have made sense when merchants used it. The lift opening may have made sense when goods moved vertically. The large room may have made sense when dozens of people occupied it. The architecture has not necessarily become irrational. Its context has disappeared. And this brings us back to Tartaria. The term has become associated online with theories about a forgotten civilization, unusual architecture, and a hidden historical narrative. But the physical evidence in any individual building must be evaluated separately. A strange door is not proof of Tartaria. An ornate building is not proof of Tartaria. An unexplained interior is not proof of Tartaria. What the evidence can legitimately do is challenge our assumptions about how particular buildings were used. And that is where the investigation becomes much more interesting, because perhaps we do not need an extraordinary explanation. Perhaps the extraordinary thing is simply that ordinary history is more complicated than the simplified version we inherited. Maybe these buildings were commercial machines. Maybe their upper floors were packed with activity. Maybe interior galleries functioned as markets. Maybe adjacent properties were connected. Maybe certain spaces were later closed because the economic system changed. Or maybe some of the interpretations are wrong, and future research will reveal much simpler explanations. That uncertainty is not a weakness. It is the reason to keep investigating. The strongest historical mysteries are not the ones where every answer is already known. They are the ones where the physical evidence asks a question that the surviving records cannot fully answer. And few questions are more visually powerful than a door that leads nowhere. Because every such doorway forces us to imagine what once existed on the other side. Maybe there was another room. Maybe another building. Maybe a bridge. Maybe a gallery. Maybe a lift. Maybe a staircase. Or maybe something completely ordinary that has simply vanished. The door is still there. The connection is gone. And that tiny architectural contradiction becomes a window into a much larger problem. How much of the past survives physically after its meaning has disappeared? We often imagine history as something written in books and preserved in archives. But buildings preserve history differently. They preserve mistakes, repairs, renovations, abandoned systems, old boundaries, changed functions, and forgotten habits. A building can tell us that something existed even when it cannot tell us exactly what that something was. That distinction is incredibly important. The goal is not to force every unexplained feature into a predetermined story. The goal is to learn how to read the evidence. So the next time you walk through an old downtown district, don't just look at the grand towers and beautiful facades. Look up. Look at the second floor. Look at the third. Look at the doors. Look at the windows. Look at the staircases. Look for openings that seem too large, too high, or completely out of place. Look for walls that appear newer than the structure around them. Look for sealed corridors. Look for old utility lines. Look for places where two buildings almost seem to fit together. And then, ask one simple question. What was this space before it became what I see today? You may discover that the answer is completely ordinary, and that is okay, because even an ordinary answer can reveal an extraordinary amount about how cities once worked. Maybe the door led to a neighboring building. Maybe the staircase served a gallery. Maybe the upper floor was once a busy market. Maybe the entire structure was connected to a network of workshops and warehouses. Or maybe the strange feature was simply the result of decades of renovations. Whatever the answer, the building has already given you something valuable, a reason to look closer. Because history is not always hidden underground. Sometimes it is directly above your head. Sometimes it is behind a wall. Sometimes it is underneath layers of paint. Sometimes it is visible in the wear of a staircase. And sometimes it is sitting in plain sight in the form of a door that no longer seems to have a purpose. The past does not always disappear. Sometimes we simply forget how to read it. And perhaps that is the real mystery behind these old buildings. Not that they necessarily belonged to a secret civilization. Not that every sealed doorway proves a forgotten empire. But that the people who built and used these structures may have experienced their cities in ways that are almost impossible for us to imagine today. Their streets may have been only one layer of urban life. Their buildings may have been deeper. Their businesses may have extended upward. Their connections may have run through walls, courtyards, galleries, and upper floors. And when those systems disappeared, the architecture remained behind as a kind of fossil. The people were gone. The businesses changed. The corridors were sealed. The stairs became obsolete. The doors became meaningless. But the structure remembered. So the next time you encounter a door that leads nowhere, don't immediately walk past it. Stop for a moment. Look at the frame. Look at the wall around it. Look at the floor. Look at the ceiling. Ask what used to exist beyond that opening. Because maybe the answer will reveal nothing mysterious at all, or maybe it will reveal a forgotten layer of the building's history. Either way, you are doing something important. You are refusing to assume that the building has always been exactly as you see it. And sometimes that single assumption is enough to change the way you see an entire city. The strangest doors may not be entrances to secret worlds. They may simply be entrances to forgotten ones. And the remarkable thing is that many of them are still standing, waiting for someone to ask the right question. So if you ever find yourself walking past an old building and notice a doorway that seems to lead nowhere, remember this. A door does not have to open today to tell you that something once existed beyond it. A staircase does not have to lead somewhere now to prove that people once climbed it. And a building does not have to explain itself for its walls to preserve the evidence of its past. Sometimes the architecture is the archive. Sometimes the mystery is the modification. And sometimes the most important part of a lost history is not what remains open, but what someone decided to close. If you enjoyed this investigation, subscribe for more stories exploring the strange details hidden inside forgotten architecture. And remember, the next time you walk through an old city, don't just look at the street, look up, because the history you are searching for may be standing directly above you.